Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the sources you send us, dig in, and pull out the key insights you need to get up to speed fast.
Yeah, we try to cut through the noise, skip the really dense stuff, and just get to those aha moments.
Exactly. And today, we are diving into Thomas Hobbes. We've got bits of Leviathan, of course.
Can't talk Hobbes without Leviathan.
Right. And also a critique of his sovereign idea, a comparison with Locke and Rousseau, and some academic papers, too.
It's a good mix. So our goal, our mission, if you like, is to really get a handle on Hobbes's big ideas.
Yeah, sovereignty, the state of nature, everyone knows that bit, and the social contract.
And we'll look at some criticisms, too, maybe find a few things that aren't so obvious.
Okay, let's start with the big one. The sovereign, absolute power. That critique source really hammers this home.
It does. It says, the rights of the sovereign emerged from the institution of a commonwealth.
And that one of those rights is absolute power given by the subjects.
Yeah, all powers belong to him. It even says it's injustice for anyone to dissent or try to overthrow the sovereign.
That's quite extreme, isn't it?
Yeah.
No room for disagreement there.
It's very firm. And this power, it all stems from the social contract, according to the comparison summary we have.
Right, the idea that people basically trade freedom for safety to get out of that nasty state of nature Hobbes talks about.
Exactly. You give up certain liberties. The summary puts it like this. A person has only as much liberty against others as they'd allow others against themselves.
So it's about equity established through a covenant, an agreement.
Crucially, it's a covenant between the people, not between the people and the sovereign. That's important.
Okay, so everyone agrees together to give up their freedom to this ruler.
Yeah, they abdicate their liberty to the sovereign's rule.
But the immediate question then is, what stops this all-powerful sovereign from just becoming a dictator, a tyrant?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It seems like a massive gamble.
Yeah, you're handing over everything.
Well, Hobbes has an answer. Maybe not one that sits easily today, but he has one.
Okay, what is it? Is it about morality?
Not exactly. The comparison summary says his only justification is basically self-interest.
Self-interest? How so?
The idea is that being a tyrant actually isn't in the sovereign's best interest.
Really? Why not?
Because, especially if it's a monarch, their ego is tied up in the kingdom's reputation.
Ah, I see. Like, they want to look good.
Exactly. The health and prosperity of the kingdom affect the perception people have of its king. So the king is naturally inclined to keep things orderly and, reputable.
Stoke the fires of his own ego, as the text puts it.
Right. It's a kind of enlightened self-interest, perhaps driven by vanity, as you said earlier.
That's fascinating. And he contrasts this with, like, a council or parliament.
Yeah, the argument there is that if power is spread out, no single person has that same intense personal stake. So maybe there's more risk of corruption, not less.
Counterintuitive, maybe?
Mm-hmm.
But I see the logic he's using.
It all comes back to avoiding what he saw as the ultimate disaster.
The state of nature. Let's get into that. The famous solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short life.
That's the one. It's his picture of life before any government, any rules, just pure self-interest.
So what does that actually look like according to the sources? Paint the picture for us.
Well, Leviathan describes it as a time of war, where every man is enemy to every man.
Constant fear, danger of violent death. Sounds awful.
Truly. And the comparison summary adds context. Everyone's basically equal, but equal in their vulnerability. The strongest person can still be killed in their sleep.
Right. And resources are scarce. No police, no courts.
None of that. No power to enforce anything. Just a constant struggle to survive based on your own strength and smarts.
Okay, but if people are rational, wouldn't they eventually just figure out that cooperating is better for everyone? Why the perpetual war?
That's where it gets really interesting. There's this game theory angle in one of the papers, the explanation of conflict.
Game theory.
In Hobbes. Well, the analysis uses that lens. It talks about fools.
Fools. With an E.
Yeah, Hobbes' spelling. These are people who might break agreements for their own gain, maybe just for glory or reputation.
Okay, so like unpredictable actors.
Exactly. And even if most people want to cooperate, the fear of running into a fool, someone who will exploit your trust when there are no police,
Means that even rational people might choose not to cooperate, just to protect themselves.
Precisely. The risk of being betrayed is just too high. The potential harm outweighs the potential benefit of cooperation, especially when you can't be sure about the other person.
It's that maximum idea mentioned in the paper, right? Minimize your maximum loss. Don't trust anyone. because the worst outcome, getting killed, is catastrophic.
You got it. It creates a trap, a cycle of distrust and conflict, even among people who might otherwise prefer peace.
Wow. Okay, so that really sets up why society
Yeah.
and the sovereign are needed. But it's such a stark contrast to someone like Rousseau.
Oh, absolutely. Rousseau had a completely different starting point. Much more optimistic about human nature, much more focused on liberty.
He's the man is born free and everywhere he is in chains guy, right?
That's him. The comparison summary quotes him saying, "You can't have a moral political system if it denies liberty. To renounce liberty is to renounce being human," basically.
So his social contract wasn't about giving up liberty for security.
No, not in the same way. For Rousseau, it was about forming a community based on the general will.
The general will, meaning what exactly?
Sort of the collective good, what everyone would want if they were thinking rationally, and for the benefit of all. It's about creating a state through consent, where people remain free and equal, not subject to an absolute ruler.
Popular sovereignty, then. Very different from Hobbes.
Night and day, really.
Okay, but let's go back to Hobbes for a second. He does talk about laws of nature, even in that pre-society state. How does that work if there's no one enforcing them?
Good question. According to the Leviathan introduction source, a law of nature, lex naturalis, is basically a rule found out by reason.
Found out by reason.
Yeah, a rule that tells you what not to do if you want to preserve your own life. Like, don't do things that are self-destructive.
So it's rational self-preservation.
Exactly. And he makes a key distinction between right, which is the liberty to do anything you need to survive, and law, which is an obligation found by reason.
Okay, so what are the main laws of nature he identified?
First, the most fundamental one is seek peace and follow it. When you can, anyway.
Seek peace. Makes sense if you want to survive.
And the second law follows from that. It's basically be willing to lay down your right to everything if others are willing to do the same.
Reciprocity.
Yes. Be content with only as much liberty against others as you would allow them against you.
That sounds almost like the golden rule.
It's very similar in principle, yeah. Applied to rights and survival.
But again, the enforcement problem. If you lay down your weapons, metaphorically speaking, but the other guy doesn't.
So you're exposed. Exactly. And that brings us back to covenants or agreements.
Right. What makes them valid?
Hobbes is very clear in the Leviathan introduction. If you make a covenant in the state of nature where you just trust each other to perform later,
Yeah.
it's void if there's any reasonable suspicion, because there's no power to force compliance.
So promises are worthless without a cop, essentially.
Pretty much. But, he says, if there be a common power set over them both, it is not void.
The sovereign.
The Leviathan. That's the key. The existence of that power makes covenants binding.
And this is where justice comes from, for Hobbes.
Yes. He argues in Leviathan that where there's no covenant, nothing is unjust because everyone has a right to everything. Justice, he says, consisteth in keeping of valid covenants.
But covenants are only valid once you have a civil power.
Bingo. So no sovereign, no valid covenants, no justice. It's all tied together.
And following that logic, the subjects can't punish the sovereign, right? Because they authorized all the sovereign's actions by making the covenant.
That's his argument. Since every subject is the author of the sovereign's actions, punishing the sovereign would be like punishing yourself or punishing someone else for your own actions. It's a neat, if maybe unsettling, piece of logic.
It really all circles back to the necessity of that absolute power to avoid the war of all against all.
That's the constant refrain. He explicitly states, sovereign power ought in all commonwealths to be absolute. Why? Because the consequences of not having it are so much worse.
But perpetual war is worse than a potentially bad ruler.
That's the trade-off he presents. He also dismisses attempts to limit sovereign power, saying that just creates another power struggle.
And he wasn't keen on people invoking liberty based on, say, ancient Greece or Rome.
Not at all. He thought people got confused, mistaking the right of the public for their own private inheritance.
So they misunderstand what liberty means in a state.
Yeah, he felt this misunderstanding, this false show of liberty just led to chaos and people trying to control their sovereigns, which undermined the whole point of having one.
Interesting. Okay, let's shift slightly. What about religion? How does Hobbes see its role in all this?
Well, he was very aware of religion's power for social cohesion or conflict.
Right. He lived through times of intense religious war.
Exactly. And he observed, as he writes in Leviathan, that founders of states often deliberately used religion.
How so?
They'd claim their laws came not from themselves, but from, some god or other spirit. to make people obey.
Divine authority as a tool for control. He gives examples.
Yeah, Numa Pompilius in Rome, the first Inca ruler in Peru, Muhammad, all used this strategy, according to Hobbes, to ensure obedience.
So, in his ideal commonwealth, under the sovereign, what's the subject's religious duty?
His line is basically, unless you've had a direct personal revelation from God,
Which most people haven't.
right, then you should obey the laws of the Commonwealth regarding religion as if they were divine law, as long as they don't contradict the fundamental moral law or a law of nature.
So, the sovereign effectively dictates the public practice of religion.
Pretty much. All subjects are bound to obey that for divine law, which is declared to be so by the laws of the Commonwealth. Again, it's about maintaining order and preventing religious conflict from tearing the state apart.
State authority trumps individual religious interpretation for the sake of peace.
That's the Hobbesian solution. It's fascinating, too, that source on Leviathan's reception notes that some radical religious groups at the time actually liked parts of his argument.
Really? Why?
Because his view of church governance seemed to undermine the authority of the established Presbyterian and Episcopalian churches. They saw it as useful for their own cause.
Politics makes strange bedfellows, I guess.
Doesn't it just? Shows how ideas can be interpreted and used in unexpected ways.
Well, this has been quite the tour through Hobbes' world. We've hit the absolute sovereign, the grim state of nature, the social contract logic.
The laws of nature, the role of religion, the need for power to make justice possible. Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground based on these sources.
And looked at how different thinkers, like Rousseau, offered very different paths.
Definitely. The contrast is stark.
So, for you listening, the question remains, how relevant is Hobbes today? Does his cynical take on human nature resonate with our world?
Is that trade-off liberty for security ever truly justifiable to the extent Hobbes argued? Is absolute power ever the answer?
And thinking about the criticisms, the potential for tyranny, the suppression of rights, how do we find that balance?
Right. How do we get the order and security Hobbes craved without sacrificing the individual freedoms that thinkers like Rousseau championed? Are there other models, maybe drawing from Locke or others, that offer a better way?
Lots to think about there. We really encourage you to check out the sources yourselves, maybe read some Locke and Rousseau alongside Hobbes. It's a debate that's definitely not over.
Not by a long shot.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.